This is part 2 of the story. All his life, Albert Taylor had been fascinated by anything that had to do with bees. As a small boy, he used often to catch them in his bare hands and go running with them into the house to show his mother, and sometimes he would put them on his face and let them crawl about over his cheeks and neck, and the astonishing thing about it all was that he never got stung. On the contrary, the bees seemed to enjoy being with him. They never tried to fly away, and to get rid of them, he would have to brush them off gently with his fingers. Even then, they would frequently return and settle again on his arm or hand or knee, any place where the skin was bare. His father, who was a bricklayer, said there must be some witch's stench about the boy, something noxious that came oozing out through the pores of the skin, and that no good would ever come of it, hypnotizing insects like that. But the mother said it was a gift given him by God, and even went so far as to compare him with St. Francis and the birds. As he grew older, Albert Taylor's fascination with bees developed into an obsession. By the time he was 12, he had built his first hive. The following summer, he had captured his first swarm. 2 years later, at the age of 14, he had no less than 5 hives standing neatly in a row against the fence in his father's small backyard, and already apart from the normal task of producing honey. He was practicing the delicate and complicated business of rearing his own queens, grafting larvae into artificial cell cups, and all the rest of it. He never had to use smoke when there was work to do inside a hive, and he never wore gloves on his hands or a net over his head. Clearly there was some strange sympathy between this boy and the bees, and down in the village, in the shops and pubs, they began to speak about him with a certain kind of respect, and people started coming up to the house to buy his honey. When he was 18, he had rented 1 acre of rough pasture alongside a cherry orchard, down the valley about a mile from the village, and there he had set out to establish his own business. Now, 11 years later, he was still in the same spot, but he had 6 acres of ground instead of 1, 240 well-stocked hives, and a small house that he'd built mainly with his own hands. He had married at the age of 20, and that, apart from the fact that it had taken them over 9 years to get a child, had also been a success. In fact, everything had gone pretty well for Albert until this strange little baby girl came along and started frightening them out of their wits by refusing to eat properly and losing weight every day. He looked up from the magazine and began thinking about his daughter. This evening, for instance, when she had opened her eyes at the beginning of the feed, he had gazed into them and seen something that frightened him to death, a kind of misty, vacant stare, as though the eyes themselves were not connected to the brain at all, but were just lying loose in their sockets, like a couple of small gray marbles. Did these doctors really know what they were talking about? He reached for an ashtray and started slowly picking the ashes out from the bowl of his pipe with a matchstick. One could always take her along to another hospital, somewhere in Oxford, perhaps. He might suggest that to Mabel when he went upstairs. He could still hear her moving around in the bedroom, but she must have taken off her shoes now and put on slippers because the noise was very faint. He switched his attention back to the magazine and went on with his reading. He finished an article called Experiences in the Control of Nausea, and then turned the page and began reading the next one, the latest on royal jelly. He doubted very much whether there would be anything in this that he didn't know already. What is this wonderful substance called royal jelly? He reached for the tin of tobacco on the table beside him, began filling his pipe, still reading. Royal jelly is a glandular secretion produced by the nurse bees to feed the larvae immediately they have hatched from the egg. The pharyngeal glands of the bees produce this substance in much the same way as the mammary glands of vertebrates produce milk. The fact is of great biological interest because no other insects in the world are known to have evolved such a process. All old stuff, he told himself. But for want of anything better to do, he continued to read. Royal jelly is fed in concentrated form to all bee larvae for the first 3 days after hatching from the egg. But beyond that point, for all those who are destined to become drones or workers, this precious food is greatly diluted with honey and pollen. On the other hand, the larvae, which are destined to become queens, are fed throughout the whole of their larval period on a concentrated diet of pure royal jelly, hence the name. Above him, up in the bedroom, the noise of the footsteps had stopped altogether. The house was quiet. He struck a match and put it up to his pipe. Royal jelly must be a substance of tremendous nourishing power, for on this diet alone, the honeybee larva increases in weight 1,500 times in 5 days. This is probably about right, he thought, although for some reason it had never occurred to him to consider larval growth in terms of weight before. This is as if a 7.5-pound baby should increase in that time to 5 tons. Albert Taylor stopped and read the sentence again. He read it a third time. This is as if a 7.5-pound baby. Mabel, he cried, jumping up from his chair. Mabel, come here. He went out into the hall and stood at the foot of the stairs, calling for her to come down. There was no answer. He ran up the stairs and switched on the light on the landing. The bedroom door was closed. He crossed the landing and opened it and stood in the doorway looking into the dark room. Mabel, he said, come downstairs a minute, will you please? I've just had a bit of an idea. It's about the baby. The light from the landing behind him cast a faint glow over the bed, and he could see her dimly now, lying on her stomach with her face buried in the pillow and her arms up over her head. She was crying again. Mabel, he said, going over to her, touching her shoulder. Please come down a moment. This may be important. Go away, she said. Leave me alone.